like to offer a prayer for our class sharing today? I have a volunteer.
Thank you, God, for your blessings in our life, for a beautiful morning, for people with minds and hearts that we come together and learn and then commit ourselves to walking your way. I pray for your blessing with Jim and with us, that we can have our ears and hearts and minds open. In Jesus' name, amen.
So, this, for your guest here, this is a workshop. At least it's always been a workshop before the last 5 Sundays, counting today. And the nice thing about a workshop is you have continuity from beginning to end, and everybody has heard everything along the way. When you do this on a Sunday morning, you find out you're looking at some different faces every Sunday. So there are some people that missed critical components on prior Sundays, which is why I bounce back and refer to other things we've talked about to try and build in the continuity. So we have today and probably next Sunday, and then that will wrap up this workshop spread out over 5 or 6 Sundays. We talked about a process, which is the unfolding of the gospel in a person's life. It almost always begins with Jesus and a love of Jesus, but sometimes it begins with church and the love of Jesus comes later. That's especially true of people who are raised in the church. Sometimes that happens. But ultimately it is a commitment to Jesus and the development of a desire to serve Him. And for us, we're looking at what causes people to choose to serve Jesus in the community of Christ. What is it that we offer that transforms people's lives, that attracts people? We have talked about how that process develops. I love the analogy Paul describes. I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. Now the interesting thing is even God can't force that plant to grow. And as we have discussed in several stories to date, that process can go quickly in a matter of months, or it can take 10 or 12 or 15 or more years. We do not determine how fast that plant grows. And although God sometimes, and I believe is always involved in lives, God does not force it on us either. Some theologians said, life would be so much simpler if God just made us all behave. And took away all of our agency and forced us to do all the right things. But that's not how the system works. We believe in agency, people choose. That is why people choose to grow at whatever pace they choose to grow. We've also talked about how that path of growth is sometimes straight-lined and quick. Sometimes it goes like almost nowhere and then spurts up years later. And often it's an up and down thing that people are more interested in. Their interest wanes and flags and grows and diminishes over time. We control none of that. That's between that person and God struggling with that person and in their life. What we can do is really valuable things along the way. We can provide some watering. We can provide at the right time a little bit of fertilizer. You remember the David York pile of manure story that I shared early on? Too much too soon will kill a tender plant. And some people with only a modest curiosity about the gospel are overwhelmed when we overdo things. So it's best if we throttle back and provide what people need at the point in their life in which they need it. So I made a list of stories. These are all people I have worked with who have joined our church. Those stories are all unique and different, but certain principles are the same. Some of those people took 16 years, some people it took 4 months. I don't control that. That's between them and God and their responsiveness. What we've been talking about since the second Sunday is the signs that we see visibly of what's going on invisibly in their spiritual life. What was the first word I used when they barely know anything about us? Awareness. Awareness eventually develops in some people, not everybody, into what? Curiosity. I get curiosity questions all the time. What church do you go to? Well, two actually. There's the big one out on West Main, and then there's the one north on Elk Chapel Road. Now, when I say that, what usually comes next when I'm talking to somebody in our community that knows nothing about me or either of our congregations? What's the next question when I say I go to two churches? Why do you go to two churches? That's why I say that. I never say, well, I go to the Community of Christ, because that's the end of the conversation. So I always leave a little teaser there, which they may or may not respond to. I don't do this. Take this. That's rude. You know, you put something there and say, if you want it someday, pick it up. That's how good missionaries work. It's not coercion. Somebody said to my dad, I said this last week, so you believe in low-pressure missionary work? And my dad said, no, I believe in no-pressure missionary work. I make things available. There is no pressure, not even low-grade, sneaky, subversive pressure. It's just making opportunities as attractive as possible and see if they will pick it up. So, curiosity is our first outward sign that somebody is curious is they will do what? And my rule of thumb for somebody at the curiosity stage is our answers should be short, sweet, and simple. Here's an example. We'll go through it one more time. We did it like 3 weeks ago. This is when our name was much longer. Oh, are you a Mormon? My answer, my really short answer is no. Our denomination is very different from the Mormon Church. How short was that? That's usually the end of the conversation. Oh, you're different, that's all. But some people will ask the next question.
How are you different?
And my answer is still another short one. It's always short answers. If they want to know more, they'll do what? Ask more. So my next answer is, well, our beliefs in several major theological categories are fundamentally different. Now, I haven't described a single one, have I? If they want to know more, they'll ask. If they ask, you know, what's my next question? What's my next answer? If they say, well, how are you different? My answer is this. What we believe about God, humanity, salvation, and marriage is very different. Just to name a few topics. What did I just tell them? We're different in the most important areas. We're not getting into temple stuff and minutia. You go to the core of it all. What we believe about God, humanity, salvation, and marriage is very different. Now, if they want to know more, if they pick one of them and say, well, what is your belief? How is your belief about God? Now, listen to what I say and what I don't say. We believe that God is one eternal, unchangeable being, ever loving and compassionate. The Mormon belief is very different than that. What did I not describe?
Their belief.
Yes, it's not my job to tell them about their beliefs that I don't like or disagree with. It's my job to present clearly our belief and then just simply say their belief is very different. Now, there are some people that really do want to dig into it. If they really wanted to go into detail, I will do that. But I want to minimize as much as possible comments about not only the Mormon Church, but other churches also, even though we have a lot more in common with Protestantism than we do with Mormonism. Not too many Protestants believe that the person that's God now used to be Adam. That's not a common belief. Most Protestants don't believe in plural marriage or eternal progression or becoming a God over your own world when you die. So I'm trying to minimize that. I try not to say things that are critical. I don't say they're just dead wrong. I say their belief is, what was my two-word phrase? very different. See, I'm trying to keep judgmental language out of my missionary work. Now, all these people are people I've worked with that have become part of our church. I'm going to say something again that I said awkwardly last week. Paul kind of called me on it. So I'm going to clarify it this week. This is based on 40 years of missionary experience. Bruce and Sherry, Bob and Melinda, Paul and Penny, Jim and Julie, George and Gail, Jean and Brenda, Mike and Becky, John and Lori, Mike and Jenny, a different Mike, Rodney and Lisa, Tim and Lynn, Dan and Carrie. All those pairs of names are people who fell in love and got married. That's one thing they have in common. The next thing they all have in common is one of them was raised in the church or joined years before they met their spouse-to-be. That's the second thing in common. The other one had no connection with the church prior to getting married to a member of our church. The third connection was this. The person who was a member of the church discovered early in their marriage relationship, or even before the marriage, that talking about our church and telling their spouse about our church in detail was fraught with difficulty and problems. As one wife said it to me very clearly, I can't talk about the church with my husband. He'll go to church with me and he likes the church people, but I can't talk about how our beliefs differ from his beliefs because he gets testy. I've heard that over and over and over and over again from spouse after spouse after spouse after spouse. You know what I always say to someone that says that to me? Your job is to live the gospel. Someone outside of your relationship needs to do the sharing of the details of the gospel. Are there exceptions to that? Yes. I can point to two couples. They are the exceptions. They are not the rule. The rule is, it is very difficult for a married couple, one of whom is Community of Christ and one of whom is of some other faith, it is very difficult for the Community of Christ member to describe in detail the faith without it becoming a testy discussion. That's why in every one of these cases, the spouse brought me into the picture and I became the person to tell the story. If the non-member spouse, I don't really like that phrase, if the person of a different faith than ours gets mad at me, guess what? I'm going to go home at the end of the evening. They can still hug and kiss when they go to bed that night. I'm just saying, we should never burden a person who is a member of the church with saying, well, it's your job to get them into the church. That's the worst possible kind of advice for somebody married to a person of another faith. Someone else has to step in and do that job. The exceptions are there. The exceptions are few. I don't know why it is that way. I'm just saying 40 years of experience and a long list of names have taught me when one is a member of our faith and one is a member of another faith, someone outside that relationship needs to do the telling of the story. All right. Last week we talked about treasures of the restoration. Ultimately, someone joins our church because they catch fire about something that we cherish in our movement. We're not just saying, okay, we're one more generic church. Ours is as good as somebody else's. Go ahead and join us. No, there are some ways in which we are unique. That's okay. In fact, in many ways, I think that's good and divine. I don't know many people who belong to churches where God brings messages to their movement through a prophetic type leader. That's kind of rare. How many churches have 3 books of Scripture in the Protestant world? Very few. How many have bivocational ministers? Not many. I learned something as a teacher, school teacher / pastor. Thanks to Dorothy, who wrote for the county newspaper, the minute I became a pastor, it was plastered on the front page of the newspaper. I walked into this class Sunday morning. One of my first members walked in the door and said, "Good morning, Reverend." Another one came in and said, "Good morning, Pastor." Another one walked in the door, you can guess their faith, "Hello, Father." Everybody in my band suddenly knew I was an ordained minister. That was first thing in the morning. Lunch period. I did my potty patrol duty, and when potty patrol was over, that's where you try and keep kids from squishing ketchup packets in the hall. I mean, that's what you do when you're in junior and senior high school. You put a ketchup or mustard packet in your pocket. You walk out in the hallway when nobody's looking. You drop it on the floor and go, and you do your best to splatter ketchup and mustard around the people around you. Now that's why teachers stand around the hallway to try and stop that kind of activity. And you can reduce it. You can't end all of it. It just happens. At the lunch break, and they said, "All right, so how does this work? How can you be a pastor and a school teacher?" I said, "That's simple." Now note the phrase I use, which I recommend to you. I said, all of our ministers are bivocational. What phrase did I not use? I never used the phrase lay minister. You know why? That sounds like second class. What?
I said, or no one knows what it means.
Or nobody knows what it means. Bivocational, that invites questions. They say, "Well, exactly what do you mean by that?" I said, "We have 4 ministers in our congregation. We all have a secular occupation. We are all also ordained ministers, and we do ministry, and we are not salaried for our ministry." You know what I discovered? They love that. You mean you just do it because you love it? Because some of them have grown up questioning the sincerity of somebody they knew in their faith. You know, is he really here because he loves us, or is he really here because he's paid well? They have had those thoughts. They can't think that about our ministers. We're not doing this because we're paid well. We're doing it because it's a calling, because it's a love. You know, after 11 years of teaching, when I was employed by the church, all of a sudden, you know what I became in the eyes of my fellow teachers when they heard that this was my last year teaching? Okay, now I'm just like every other minister. You're just paid to do it. It was more impressive to them when I did it as a volunteer. Not only that, as a team of volunteers. And I said, "Well, what do the other ministers in your congregation do?" I said, "One's a research chemist, one is a plumber, another one's a school teacher like me." They found that impressive too. "So you mean school teachers and plumbers and whatever can be ministers?" I said, "Any occupation, or retired, or whatever." So I have learned through 40 years of ministry, some phrases are magic and some are puzzling. Bivocational ministers is a magic phrase. That's the phrase I automatically defer to when somebody asks us about our priesthood. It's a cool thing. All right.
Why not self-supporting? We sometimes use that.
I find that less intriguing than bivocational. I've used it, not often, not with much success. So I'm trying to share with you what I have found works for me, and most of the ministers I know who do what I do, who train other people how to witness. Bivocational seems to be the best phrase to spark curiosity and interest. Now, self-supporting, that makes sense, but it has less of a, bivocational has a nicer connotation somehow. I don't know why. I'm not a Protestant. It's hard for me to look at it like Protestants do, but I know a lot of Protestants who have joined our church, and I've asked them what kind of language and terminology they like, and I have altered over my years the vocabulary I use to the vocabulary that people outside that have come in have told me is the most effective language to use. Now,
I think self-supporting sometimes can infer, I'm rich and I can just do this.
yes, that is one of the risks.
Instead of I have to work and I do this.
Yeah.
I think
Or
another.
I get to work, whichever one you want to look at.
I think another answer is that the first one, nobody knows what that means.
Yeah.
So they will ask you what you mean. Self-supporting stops them from asking.
Yes.
questions.
So I use language that invites them to ask another question if they want to ask another question. If they don't ask me more, I don't tell them more. I say, our ministers are bivocational. They say, oh, that's nice. Now, they may not even understood what I said, but if they don't ask me for more, I don't give them more. You want to stop when they stop asking questions. Yes?
I think another thing that intrigues people is that their ministry comes from all kinds of, a football coach is not going to preach the same kind of sermon as a teacher, let's say. But I forget what I was going to say, the rest of the part. To me, that's a real advantage, is we have this variety of viewpoints. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I would think they might have a question is, do you have to go to seminary to be ordained? And that's a different thing, because then when we say no, then they know they're also self-educated or educated through, It might have to explain what our education is before ordination.
My usual answer about seminary is, although some of us have had that opportunity, our ministers, between the time they accept the call and that they are ordained, go through a series of classes in preparation for their ordination. Now, I'm often asked about the call, and if they ask about that, they find that really intriguing, that it's not, I decided, it's somebody received light from God that a particular person was called to a specific office. All right. Now, on these steps along the way...
Jim, I wanted to comment on the bivocational. How do you avoid the impression that you can't make enough as a school teacher, so you now have 2 jobs? You don't make enough as a minister to support yourself, so you now have 2 jobs. Bivocational, to me, implies 2 paying jobs.
I guess I've not run into that problem.
Okay.
I viewed it as my vocation, I view as a calling. And I mean, I could have been a retired teacher.
Yeah.
So I viewed it as a calling, and that's why I did what I did. I felt like that was part of my purpose and my function. So that word makes a lot of sense to me, because priesthood, pastorship, is a calling. And you do it out of love and responsibility as well, but I view it as a calling. Anybody's career, I would hope, or purpose or gifts. It's a gift. It's a training.
And I have rarely been asked, I was rarely asked when I was a school teacher, well, are you paid? And when they did ask, I would say, no, I just do it. We all do it because we love it. None of us are paid anything to do the ministry we do in our congregation. So I've not found the bivocational phrase complicated, and I found, well, let me rephrase it. It is less complicated than all the other alternatives I've weighed and used. So there's nothing you can say that will not cause somebody to be confused. You just figure that. You can't talk about us without confusing somebody some of the time. All right. Interest comes next. The quality of the questions increases. They ask for more detail. This is when you start adding stories. Jesus had the misguided notion that stories were powerful. Somebody online is going to misquote that. Oh, they're going to quote it and misunderstand what I was saying. Most of the world's great speakers, religious or otherwise, have learned the power of stories. But stories come later in the process when a person's more interested. If somebody just asks you a curiosity question, that's not the time, like I did with my friend Doug Johnson, to tell a 45-minute litany of whatever. But you should practice stories. Now, we asked you last week to answer 2 questions. What you should do with those 2 questions from last week: why am I a follower of Jesus Christ? Why do I serve Him in the community of Christ? I'm hoping you still have your answer to that question. You should take each of your answers and find a story that illustrates that answer. Stories are powerful. Let me take one on my list. Fellowship. One of the things I treasure about our movement is our unique and rich fellowship. Do other faith communities have fellowship?
Yes.
Yes, they do. But what do a lot of people say who have come from somewhere else to us about our fellowship?
You guys are different.
You're different. This is special. This is unusual. This is powerful. There is something extraordinary about our fellowship. All right, let me tell you one more thing. Your stories initially should be simple and non-miraculous. I shared 2 extraordinary experiences last week. I would never share them with just a curious person outside the church. Because why? They wouldn't believe it. You got to have credibility. I preached the Knock Your Socks Off sermon in Fort Smith, Arkansas. I've been traveling to Fort Smith for about 8 years. And a dear sweet sister said, if you would come tell your stories with my neighbor, she would join our church. I said, no, she doesn't know me. She'd think I was crazy. You know who has credibility with your neighbor? And she stood there and she didn't get the question. I said, you have credibility with your neighbor. Your neighbor knows you. Your stories that you tell your neighbor will have far more credibility than me, who's an absolute stranger. Now, I'm trying to remember which stories I've shared and which I haven't. I know 2 people who were declared dead. I mean, the medical doctors spent all kinds of time trying to revive a person and bring their heart back. Everything they did failed. They pulled the sheet up over the person's head and they were wheeling him out of the room when some minister in our church came in and intervened and prayed for them, and that person came back to life. All right, now if you're skeptical, you're going to say, well, there was probably a subtle heartbeat that the doctors missed when they had all the wires hooked up to them. I mean, if you want to dismiss it, you can find a way around the plain truth. I know of 2 people, one of whom I know of 2 people, one I know personally, and I shared that story here, who was raised from the dead under the hands of an elder. I didn't tell you the sequel to that story. That story happened in the mid-50s. My dad was the elder. 30 years later, I'm in Texas. Now, if you remember back to that story, the woman who died had earlier that day given birth to a daughter, and there were disastrous consequences of giving birth at a more mature age than most people give birth at. And they labored mightily all day to keep her going. And then when she crashed that night, my dad got the phone call. He had them put it on her chart. If there's a life-threatening emergency, call me. And he was there. He walked in the door with the husband. They walked into the room as she was being wheeled out of the room. The doctors had spent over 30 minutes trying to start her heart and revive her, and they had failed. She was on her way to the morgue. So for those of you who weren't there, my dad said, stop. He pulled the sheet off her head. He walked over. He anointed her head with oil. He prayed for her. Her eyelids started to flutter. By the end of the prayer, she was breathing. By sunrise the next morning, she was sitting up in bed. And that afternoon, she went home. So short version for those of you who weren't here 3 weeks ago. 30 years later, mid-1980s, Dallas, Texas, church conference. A young woman walked up to me. She said, do you know who I am? And I looked at her name tag. I didn't recognize the last name. And she said, I'm Harriet's daughter. And then she looked at me and she said, do you know what your dad did for my mother back in Pueblo? I says, yes, I know the story. And we hugged and we talked, and she walked away, and I didn't put together her age with the time sequence, and it hit me on my way home from Dallas. She was the girl who was born hours before her mother died, tracking down the son of the man who prayed for her mother. Now, I have never shared that story outside of the household of faith. Who would understand it? Who would comprehend it? Most people don't come from a religious background that sees that as a common thing, with the exception of some Pentecostals who believe in that sort of thing, right? But that's kind of rare amongst most of our Protestant friends. Just kind of don't believe in that whole thing any more than they believe in prophecy or speaking in language you don't know or understanding a language you've never heard before, like I gave examples last week. Most people aren't ready for that stuff. So you start with simple stories. You save the fancy stories, the amazing stories, to when they're well down the road towards becoming a part of our community. Here's my simple fellowship story. St. Paul's School of Theology, December 1982. One of my table mates, we're all at tables, not classrooms, tables. One of my table mates said to me at lunch, "I'm really worried about my trip home." I said, "How come?" She says, "My old beat-up Volkswagen is falling apart. And I'm driving all the way home," and I says, "Where's home?" And I can't remember if it was Portland or, it was somewhere on the Pacific Northwest coast. So she's going to drive from Kansas City, Missouri, all the way out to the Pacific coast in an old beat-up Volkswagen. She's, "I'm afraid my car won't make it, and what will happen if it just dies on me?" I said, "I will have your answer tomorrow." And she said something like, "Why, are you a mechanic?" I said, "Oh, no, that's not the answer. I can't fix your car before tomorrow." I went home and I got my church directory. How many of you have seen a church directory or own one? You look through and it has every state, has every congregation, has pastors. Back then it had addresses and phone numbers and stuff that we probably think is not safe nowadays, but we published it back then in the 80s. And I found every pastor between Kansas City, Missouri, and the Pacific coast. And I wrote down their name and their city and their phone number. And I brought her that list the next day. And I said, "If you have trouble anywhere, you call whoever's closest. I promise you they will help you." She says, "Do you know all of them?" I said, oh no, I don't. I said, "I know the pastor in Nebraska City and Plattsmouth and in Lincoln, Nebraska, and in Grand Island and Hastings, and Kearney and Cozad and North Platte, and Ogallala. I know all those pastors. They know me. But from Ogallala on west, I don't know any of them." She said, "How do you know they'll help me?" "Because it's what the pastors in my church do." She says, "Are you serious?" I says, "Yes." "You call them and say, 'Jim Doty, a member of your church, promised me that if I got in trouble, you would help me.'" She said, "But they don't all know you." I said, "No, they don't. You just need to give them a name so they know who gave you their name. Just say, 'Jim Doty, a member of your church, told me,' and then I went through the routine." And she says, "They will really help me?" I said, "Yeah." She says, she named her Protestant denomination. I belong to X denomination. If I call somebody in the middle of nowhere, I have zero confidence that somebody would come help an absolute stranger in my community, my faith community." And she named a big, prestigious Protestant denomination. I said, "Okay, we're different. I can't explain how and why." And she says, "Thank you." She says, "I will have this with me all the way there and all the way back." And I said later that night, "God, as much as I'm tempted, I don't want her to break down to prove what I said. I want her to have a nice trip all the way there and back." But I was fully confident that it didn't matter where. She broke down anywhere. I am absolutely confident that whoever she called would help her. Now that's my simple testimony story. No miracles involved. So I'm just suggesting that to you.
Could I tell a real short support to that? Our two kids, they travel a lot, and they both carried the church directory with them. Kathy was to audition for a violin job on the East Coast, and she was on the way, but she needed to practice before that audition. And so she calls up this pastor in Ohio somewhere, said, "Could I please practice in the church?" Well, of course, and he came down, unlocked it, and he came to check on her and said, "Would you come to our house for dinner?" and she practiced, in the church just because of our denomination fellowship. And she went on to the East Coast and did the audition.
Now I want you to know I have treasured relationships amongst our faith brothers and sisters in other denominations. I shared with you a very special relationship with a Baptist pastor that lived just a block away from me. And how he showed up the first time, and when he came back to my house, how he shared with my congregation, how my congregation went to his congregation for Wednesday night. Let me talk about the Methodist minister in the little town where I taught school. I would do lessons after school with all the band kids, and in the winter it would be dark when I would be walking home from school. 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, cold December, January night, I'm walking home. That's because Melissa has our only car up in Omaha where she's doing training as a medical technologist. So we had one car, I walked across town, she drove to Omaha. So I saw a light on every Tuesday and Thursday night in the Methodist church. So one day I thought I would drop in and visit. I knocked on the door, I came in. I said, hi, I'm Jim Doty. He says, I'm Bob Call. I'm the pastor here. He said, I know your name. He said, a bunch of my high school kids in my congregation are in your band. You probably ought to know they speak very highly of you. Well, that made me feel good. I was glad they did. He said, what brings you here? I said, curiosity. I saw a light, thought I'd come in. He said, have a seat. We had a long talk. We had a great time. That was the first of many Tuesday night visits on my way home from school. One thing led to another, and he says, what does your church believe about home ministry? I said, let me quote to you. And I opened up my briefcase, pulled out a Doctrine and Covenants, went to section 17. I read the responsibilities of the priest. He says, that's great. He said, that's not what I was taught in seminary. Going into somebody's home is a dangerous thing. So don't mess things up. Just stay at church, let them come to you if they need you. That's what I was taught in seminary, at least in my seminary. I said, no, we believe in home ministry. I said, some of my best ministries are things that happened when I was sitting across the kitchen table from somebody in my congregation. And he says, so what is that book? I says, this is the Doctrine and Covenants. He says, what is it? I said, it's a book of modern day revelations through the prophets of our church. He said to me, I confess a little ornery came in on my part. He said to me, can I have a copy? And I said, God forgive me, I don't know. Let me see if I can get approval. Okay, that was shameful. And then I looked at it and said, no, I'm just messing with you. I will get you a copy. Not only did I buy him a copy, I bought him a new copy, I went through with colored pencils and marked the absolute best passages from beginning to end. My 20 number one, A1 best passages. There are average passages in the Doctrine and Covenants. There's a little bit of junk in there. You all know that. If you've read the whole thing, there's some nonsense in there. But there are wonderful, powerful, inspired words. I highlighted those because I wanted to see that stuff first. Sooner or later, he would find some of the stuff and go, I don't know about this. And that's okay, because anybody who's read the whole thing cover to cover has looked at some passages and said, no, sorry, Joseph, what did you have for dinner that night?
Same
All right.
thing is true about the Bible, though.
So, yes, and the Book of Mormon. Those are topics for another day. He loved the Doctrine and Covenants. And one day he said to me, now I don't tell my congregation, but every now and a little bit of Doctrine and Covenants slips into my sermons. See, that goes right along with my Baptist friend who was sneaking Book of Mormon passages into his sermons without telling his congregation. Because there's some great stuff in both those books. There's some nonsense in both those books. The Bible is a dangerous place. So be that as it may. All right. There are people who are aware of us. There are people who are curious. There are people who are interested. That's when we tell stories. When they develop a hunger to know, that's when you can verge into the stuff that is more amazing in your stories. Now, practice your stories. You may not believe this, but I practice my stories so I tell them well. I write them down. Today, at 5 o'clock this morning, I pulled out a story and I rewrote it. Because I thought, I think I could word this a little better. I think I'll leave this out. I think we'll add this. So this morning, sitting at my desk, praying about this class, I was rewriting a story, which may or may not end up in this class this week or next week.
Jim, I learned a hard lesson, and that is be careful when I share stories in front of people with Evelyn within earshot, because her memory of the facts, and I would wonder if you and your wife deal with the same thing where you tend to embellish things, and your better half calls you out and says, that's not how it happened.
I do not deliberately embellish stories. I have misremembered details of a story. And God bless Melissa. She will call me on it.
That's what I thought.
If I make a mistake, if I make an egregious mistake in a sermon, she will raise her hand. And I will stop and she will say, what I heard you say is, didn't you really mean to say? Now, she wasn't the only one. Now, most congregations aren't brave enough because I'm not there now. But the Worthington congregation in Ohio knew me well enough. Melissa was not the only one to raise her hand and say, did you really mean what you just said? And what happens is, my brain is about, 30 seconds ahead of my mouth. And while my brain's here, my mouth is changing something that I thought 30 seconds earlier. And I misspeak. I'm a classic misspeaker. Anybody who's heard me preach a lot knows that I misspeak and say, now, oftentimes they know what I meant. They knew I meant John instead of Matthew, when I quoted, the wonderful chapter 17. But sometimes if they're puzzled, they will raise their hands. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, are you sure you really meant? And sometimes I say, yes, I really meant that. They said, that's kind of shocking. I said, yes, it is kind of shocking, but it's true. So that's how it goes. So yes, Melissa corrects me. I do not mind that at all. I prefer for her to be there, which is why I prefer to drag her with me everywhere I go, because she corrects more of my mistakes. Now, when I was gone 3 or 4 or 5 Sundays in a row, and then home a Sunday, and then gone another, and you know my schedule, I was out almost every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and usually a Tuesday and Thursday. I was in congregations, 4 or 5 congregations a week, week in, week out, year in, year out. So she couldn't go with me in all those places. So I'm so glad when she can be with me and correct me.
Okay.
And God bless the people in Oklahoma.
Am I in the wrong place?
They were brave enough also to raise their hands. All right, story.
No.
Are the children supposed to be in here right now?
Or are you supposed to be, there's some kids that were downstairs. Were you downstairs?
Oh, yeah. There are some kids downstairs.
Oh,
But you were listening to the conversation. We really appreciate that.
You come back anytime. 2002, Melissa and I moved to Ohio. Our home congregation was Worthington. There were 3 people in our congregation that carried cameras. There was John, a retired school teacher. There was John, a very active attorney in a very prestigious law firm. And then there was me. Every baptism and confirmation and ordination was documented. Not only that, every Sunday someone took a picture of who was preaching and whatever. So we probably have one of the most photographically documented congregations in the church. Now, of the 3 photographers, guess who was the most egregious?
You.
Yes, you are right. I was the most egregious. John and Lori had a daughter named Ava. In 2003, we'd been there a year. She'd watched me take pictures. Ava was maybe 2 years old when she walked up to me after church on a beautiful day and said, "Would you take my picture?" I said, "Sure." We went out the front door of the church, found a big tree. Now there were people outside visiting after church and people inside and people everywhere and kids running around. There was a park right across the street from the church. There was a nice park. There were kids playing in the park. So we went out, I put it right in front of a tree. It was a really big tree that had beautiful peeling bark and multicolored hues. I thought that'd make a great backdrop. I put it in front of the tree. I snapped a picture, several pictures actually. I picked the best, showed it to her. She really liked it. I showed it to John and Lori, and they really liked it, and I sent them the file. Several months later, Ava comes up to me again. "Would you take my picture?" Okay, it's another beautiful day, people outside playing. There's people in the park across the street. In the park there was this huge tree with a trunk that was over 7 feet in diameter and multiple huge trunks. And kids would climb in the tree. Sometimes I'd photograph kids in the tree. There was a narrow wooden bridge over a stream that was cool, a bench, a table. So we went across the street this time and we did a portrait across the street. So every few months she would do that. Along comes Erin, her little sister. Erin gets to a certain age, and Erin walks up to me one day after church and says to me,
Will you take my picture?
yes. And I said yes. So you know what we did? We went out and took pictures. So now every few weeks or months now, Erin's asking me for pictures. Leah comes along. It was my blessed privilege to share in Leah's blessing. A couple, 3 years later, Leah walks up to me after church and says, so across the street we went to the park and we took pictures and I had her stand up in this huge humongous tree. I took pictures in the tree and stuff like that. So now I have 3 sisters periodically asking me to take their pictures. When Leah turned 8, it was my happy privilege to bless her as a member of the community of Christ. So this went on until the month we moved to Iowa. And on September 2nd, 2018, all 3 sisters came up to me. We're now talking early college, high school, junior high. I've been now taking pictures of them every several months since 2003. I did individual portraits of each one. I did a portrait of the 3 of them. In between 2003 and 2018, I did several portraits of the whole family. And when John needed a new portrait for his law firm website, he called me and says, can we go to the park? I'll dress all up. You know, the bridge would be great. Can you do portraits of me for our law firm's website? I did portraits of John. They were not good. Apparently, photographing adult men is different than photographing growing girls. I don't know what's different, but there's something different. I did my best, and I looked at them all, and I said, okay, John, you really need to find somebody who's really good at this. I'm really good at what I do at some things, and I'm really not good at other things. Several months before Leah, the youngest, before her baptism and confirmation, John calls me on the phone. Now, John came to church every Sunday. He loved church. He loved the people. John's not a member. Never discussed membership, never talked about membership. Lori just prayed and bided her time wisely. And he just kept coming and watching what's going on. And he calls me up one day and he says, I need to talk. Now, little bells went off in my head. Why? What's going on? So he said, there's a restaurant. They open at 6 o'clock. That'll give us plenty of time to chat before I have to go to the law office. Tuesday morning, or I forget what the morning was, and I said, sure. So we went and talked. John talked serious heart and soul stuff with me. None of it had to do with the church. But it was serious stuff. And when it was time for him to leave for the office and drove home, I thought, whoa, all kinds of stuff is stirring up in John. You know, where's it coming from? Why is this all percolating up now? And I said to myself, I think I need another visit with John. That didn't happen. So a few months later, it's Leah's baptism and confirmation, which I shared in the confirmation as I told you. All eyes are on Leah as she goes into the font. She is immersed into the water. She comes out of the water. A voice speaks from the back of the room. Everybody turns around. There's John from where he was watching the baptism, except John was all in white. We all knew in that instant. He walked down the center aisle, went through the side door, went down into the font, and the person who couldn't hardly close the jaw dropped open from, oh my goodness, I can't believe this. He didn't tell a soul. He didn't even tell Lori, his wife. He made this decision. He decided, I'm going to surprise everybody, including my family. And so at some point he must have sneaked out, changed clothes, got back in time to watch through the glass at the back and see his youngest daughter being baptized, and then he walked down the aisle. It was an extraordinary moment. And I thought back to our visit a few months earlier, I thought, okay, there was more stirring in John's soul than what we talked about at that breakfast. And so it looked to everybody like John was in this area, and then all of a sudden, around the time before his third daughter's baptism, it all happened. We just didn't know it was happening. We cannot predict when it will happen. We cannot predict when someone in the privacy of their soul says some kind of yes to God that they have not said before. It was extraordinary. Now, Melissa and I had been in their home. We were dinner guests. We did things together. We enjoyed our time together. As you know, I spent 17 years photographing their three daughters as they grow up, as well as some like family Christmas portraits. I do kind of okay at that, and came up with something respectable. But all this time, John seemed to be floating along. And as I prayed about John, and I prayed about John as I do everybody who comes that's not a member. I do that regularly. I hope you do too. And then all of a sudden there's that breakfast, and I knew great things were stirring inside of John. I just didn't know what all of them were yet until that Sunday a few months later when he walked down that aisle all dressed in white. We wrap up next week. I have two wonderful stories to share that will tie this all together. Next week will be our last session, unless God changes things. But that's my plan. Next week will be our last session.
Jim, I think what happens to me personally, and I violate your mantra.
I know.
That you've been talking about, and that is less is more. I guess I get with people, and I don't know that I'm ever going to have the chance to be with them again. And when they ask about Community of Christ, I'm ready to burst, talking about the cool things that are different in this movement. And I don't know how to get around that. And then that's just a comment. But secondly, how do we apply? You know, in this building, we've been talking for 3 and 4 years about growing our numbers, growing our membership. You come to this town, you go to both congregations. What would you say, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here on you, but what would you say to us about having more people? I mean, you're talking about grassroots level in our interpersonal relationships, but there's got to be more for us.
So believe it or not, it's been hidden in everything I've been saying. Now let me back up to you and your style. I watched you, in a fascinating way, collar somebody at Hy-Vee who's not connected with our church at all, and you did your thing. And I was impressed, and I thought it was great because it works for you. So don't feel bad that you are far more aggressive than I am. I am a timid but effective missionary. Now I know what I'm doing is working because there's a long list of people that's been my privilege to usher into our movement, and I've only shared a tiny portion of those stories over the last 5 weeks, but I do what works for me, and because I used a kinder, gentler, low-key approach, I teach that to everybody, and every now and then there's somebody like you that breaks out of the mold, and God bless you, that's okay.
But
All right, now, what should you do? Let's go back to Steve Veazey. Finish this quote if you were here that Sunday. The victory is in the invitation. Nothing will happen here until you say to somebody out there, would you like to come to church? That is the bottom line secret. The only question is, who do you ask and when do you ask? And how do you pray about it? And do you look for signs and clues? Do you look for them to drop hints? But the bottom line is, you will not grow until people sitting in this sanctuary and in this room walk up to somebody they know and say, will you come to church? If that moment never happens, nothing else will happen. You can put advertisements on the sign. You can bring in a famous preacher to do a series. You can do all kinds of things. But you saw the statistics that I handed out 2 weeks ago. Over 95%, is that the right, 92% of the people who become a part of a church, doesn't matter what church, come because someone asked them. They don't come to church because of a Billy Graham crusade. Oh wow, this is great, I think I'll join a church. A very tiny few people come to church because of a Billy Graham crusade. It's not because of advertisements in the paper. It's not because of putting fancy videos on TV at the denominational level. I'm for all of that. I believe in exposure. I believe in putting our name out there. But the bottom line is nothing happens until someone says to someone they know, would you like to come to my church some Sunday? It's as simple as that. I will give you an example of how remarkable that can be next Sunday with my lead story, which was going to be my, well, today was different than I thought it would be, kind of several ways, starting at 5 a.m. as I rearranged my thoughts for today and tried to fill in details. But Stevie is right. The victory is in the invitation. If you ask somebody to come to church, one of two things will happen. They will come or they won't. Or they might say yes and not come. And then come some later Sunday. But nothing happens until somebody else invites somebody to come to church. Now, what I'm trying to teach you to do is develop your relationships with the people out there so that the opportunities to invite them come naturally. So I've talked about what to do every step of the way as that person develops in their curiosity and interest and hunger to know and desire to belong. So, there's no simpler way to put it. The victory is in...
Laurie,
Okay, let's do it a little more enthusiastically.
Laurie's got a comment.
The victory is in the invitation. It means you someday say to somebody, would you like to come to my church? And they'll come or they won't. If they don't come, it's not the end of the world. It's like, I told you this story before, I'm going to embarrass myself again. It's like when I was dating. It took me forever to get up enough courage to ask somebody to go to a show or a movie with me. And then one day, perish the thought, I said, if I never ask a girl out on a date, I'm never going to get to kiss a girl goodnight. So if you never invite somebody to church, you're never going to have the joy of seeing somebody you know in the waters of baptism. So, and every session through today has been about cultivating your sensitivity and relationship to people. Now this will be helpful. Every night before you go to bed, pray about all the people you know and say, okay, God, give me an opportunity. Show me the one. God will or won't. If you ask the wrong person, it won't. One day I asked the janitor at school, would you like to go to church? He says, thank you for the invitation, but probably not. He didn't come. Ask another person at the same school, would you like to go to church with Melissa and I? She said yes. 5 minutes later, she's baptized. So one said no, one said yes. Now I'm not going to guarantee that half the people you ask are going to come. More people that I've asked have not come than come. That's the price of it. There's no getting around that. You're going to get, people are not going to come that you ask. That's okay if they don't come, as long as you don't put them on the spot when you ask them. I would really love it if you would come to church with me, because if not, you're going to die in hell with all the rest of the low-life stuff. No, see, that's a gross exaggeration. Believe me, I have actually heard that on the street of an American city, and a person said that to a total stranger walking across. I thought, oh God, this is not how it's supposed to be done, and I don't care what denomination you're at, this is the wrong way. You just nicely ask somebody you care about. That means you have to have people you care about that don't come to church here. You have to have a group of people you interact with, do things with, care about, share with, talk to. So every time the new minister in town's wife comes by with her 3 little kids, anytime I spot her, Melissa and I, we go out and visit with her. We're building connections. Is she probably going to join our church? Well, since her husband's a pastor, probably not. But that's just being nice to people. We should be nice to everybody, whether or not they ever come to church, right? We should make a difference. We talked about this week too. We should make a difference in people's lives and make their lives better, whether or not they ever come to church. If we keep doing that, someone will come. Someone will join. I got all kinds of stories to prove it happens. These are all the people that somewhere along the line, things clicked. It works. It really does work. But it's as simple as looking somebody in the eye and saying, would you like to come to church? Now, about half of these, I wasn't the person that invited them to church. I was the follow-up that kicked them into high gear. I was the one that did the cottage meetings. I was the one, when the daughter was dying in the hospital, went and prayed, even though they'd never heard of anointing and prayer, before their neighbors said, we have elders in our church that do this. So it's just involve yourself in people's lives, practice all the stuff we talk about every Sunday for the last 5 Sundays counting this one, and sooner or later get up enough courage to ask somebody. If no one asks anybody, nothing will happen. Pure and simple. If you start asking people, things will start happening. Trust God to open your eyes to somebody out there if you're prayerful enough and ask God to say, help me see who might be responsive. Help me see who I should invite. Help me see who I should help even if they never join the church. What you do with people that are never going to the church is also really important. Our calling is to change lives. Some of the lives we change will be people who will become a part of us. So, God bless you. I will see you next week for our last session.